We are going to be talking about toddlers, if they're picky eaters for real, or are they just necessary nibblers? So we're already going to go ahead and get started. And I am just so honored to have my friend Ashley here. Ashley and I became good friends via Instagram. And the more I've gotten to know her, one of the things I'm most impressed with is she's an RD and she's incredibly knowledgeable about feeding young children and definitely about picky eaters. But she's reached out to me when it comes to understanding more of the fine motor aspects or some of the issues around pediatric feeding disorders. And we've had some really good chats because of that. And I'll tell you what, I just truly believe that when a speech therapist wants to learn more about nutrition, or a registered dietitian wants to know more about speech and feeding therapy, that's the way it all ought to work, is that we all work together to help these kids. So, Ashley, I know a lot about you, but I always feel like when I have my guests on, especially when they're good friends like you, that it's just best if you share with everybody a little bit about yourself. And, you're in Florida right now visiting your parents, right?
Yeah. Yes,
and I already see some of my friends from Florida popping on. So
fun. Very fun.
But tell everybody about yourself and tell them about Veggies and Virtue.
Yeah, thanks so much, Melanie, for having me. It's exciting to be here. You've been such a blessing to me in my business and being able to serve my community better with your expertise. And so I appreciate you having me on to share some of mine tonight. So I'm a mom of three. I have a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1.5-year-old. So it's busy times. We're in the trenches of everything I talk about and everything I do with Veggies and Virtue. So I started it. I worked in a pediatric hospital after graduating grad school and got some great clinical experience. But once my oldest was born, I started staying home. And very quickly, I realized I was not going to have this poster child for pediatric nutrition. And so that was a really quick, all of us moms as first time moms need that real gut check of where our pride is rooted as a parent and all these things we think we know, and really quickly find out we had no idea what it was like. So here I'd spent time working with families and advising families on picky eating at a very prestigious pediatric hospital. And here I, had my own child, and whether it was breastfeeding, never going smoothly, or introducing solids, having a lot of hiccups, the transition to table foods being a challenge. I mean, everything was a challenge with her. And so she was just so much pickier than I ever expected my own child would be. And so it just really changed my eyes as a practitioner on what this is like and how hard this is and how challenging it can be for families. And so that's really where Veggies and Virtue is born is, on my own. I was a stay-at-home mom. I still am. And so it was just really birthed from my own life and my own walk as a mom and wanting to share evidence-based resources with families, but also a lot of just empathy and encouragement. So people could see, even as a pediatric dietitian, formally trained with tons of education, there was still a lot of things that I had to learn as I went. And so that's really what I try and bring to Veggies and Virtue, is just helping other families with all things from, building their family's feeding foundation through, something you and I have chatted a lot about, the picky eating continuum and things like that. And that's really where I focus the majority of my time now, is helping families who struggle with that. So that's where I've spent the last couple of years since creating Veggies and Virtue. And I've obviously added a couple of children since my first and those initial feeding challenges. But with that, each one has, presented new feeding challenges, whether it be allergies and intolerances or just ongoing picky eating. I'm yet to have an adventurous eater, oddly enough. So I just get to keep really practicing what I preach every day. And that's just really what I want to share with other families in hopes of, helping them in their feeding journey and things like that.
That's so good. I'm just smiling a lot because you truly are in the trenches. And you and I have chatted about this before, but my kids are older now, but I had one amazing eater. First, God gave me this amazing eater. And I was like, I'm so good at this. And then he gave me my youngest daughter, who was very, very picky. And suddenly I'm like, wait, I'm parenting and doing everything the exact same way. How come this isn't working? And I love that you've shared that with everyone, that there isn't one magic formula that works for every single child, because no two kids are alike and no two parents are alike. But what we know for sure is what works overall. And then working with a professional like yourself or maybe me, we can tweak it to fit and just make it work a little bit easier. But it still takes time. It still takes time, especially when it comes to toddlers. And you're living, breathing that, and you've already experienced it with your older for sure, and swam through those waters. So tonight we're going to be talking about the fact that I think a lot of people just think toddlers are always picky. And although they move through a developmental phase of pickiness, it's really developmental. And there are things that we can do to help them emerge after about age 3 as a more adventurous eater. And they also have this tendency to kind of nibble, 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 nibble for a variety of reasons. So I think one of the biggest reasons is appetite. And I was just wondering, especially as an RD, can you chat with our audience a little bit about what is up with toddlers' appetites?
Yeah, so I think it's always what I always encourage parents to do is to look at your child's growth curve. If you look at their birth to 2 growth curve, you can really quickly see what exactly is happening to their appetite, because you see their rate of growth in infancy, particularly the first 3 months, and then even up to 6 months. It's so rapid, and that's when they're eating on demand all the time, and they need so much. And that's when a lot of times you're cluster feeding and shorter windows between feeds and things like that, because they're growing so fast. So their bodies are demanding those calories. But then as you get towards 12 months, you see the rate of growth start to taper, and it doesn't plateau, but the rate really declines from infancy. And so I always try and help parents just look at that. I'm a really visual person. So for me, that really just helps convey what is happening physiologically with their appetite. And for parents to see it's natural for them to have less of an appetite. That's why, a lot of parents say, oh, my infant was so adventurous and so eager and wanted everything. And then in toddlerhood, it just was like, stop. And so that's why I was trying to help parents understand it's normal for the appetite to decrease. And with that becomes a little bit more of the finicky habits, because they're just not as hungry. So they don't have, that appetite driving their interest in new foods. This when solids were first introduced. And so just helping parents kind of understand that it's normal for appetite to start to decline in toddlerhood. That said, like you said, that doesn't mean that we just let them nibble and kind of like graze all day either.
No. And I think the tricky thing is that we're so used to feeding on demand and seeing this little kid who's like, feed me. And they're so eager. They're such little eager eaters that first year, unless there's some medical issues going on. But for the most part, they're like, I love food. And it's kind of our window of opportunity between birth all the way up to about 18 months. But then we start to see the appetite decrease because they just don't need as much as they did. And growth really starts to slow down. Yet, we're still behaving the same way. We're like, you got to be hungry. Come on. Like you. Come on. You're hungry, aren't you?
Yes.
And So what sorts of things can we establish early on to create a routine where we're not feeding our toddler as if they're a 7-8 month old?
Yes. So I think that's a great question, because one thing that we do in infancy that we don't want to do once table foods are regularly established is feeding on demand. As an infant, it's appropriate to be feeding them on demand. But as table foods are introduced, we want to start establishing a little bit more routine. And I always want to encourage parents, this is not a strict by the clock schedule, so to speak, but it's getting in the rhythm of what your role as the parent is in the feeding relationship and what your child's role is, and starting to transition. But, between 1 and 2, and with my academy families, which is the group coaching program I do, with those families, I always see the families between 1 and 2 struggle the most with adopting the division of responsibility, which I'm sure a lot of your audience is familiar with. But being the roles in the feeding relationship, it seems that toddler window is always the hardest time for parents to begin to establish those boundaries in feeding, because we still see our little ones as babies. I have a 21-month-old. I get it. I'm not ready for him to be 2. I don't want him to be a baby. I mean, he has 2 older sisters, so he's kind of, aged up a little bit in that regard. But it's so easy to just kind of, want to tend to them. And if they protest for something, we think we should give in. And it just seems like such an innocent window. But I think what parents miss is that it's such an impressionable window. And so if we see it as too immature, innocent and almost infantile, then we lose that opportunity to help them develop into a well-established able to maintain routine 3-year-old. And so what we also want parents to understand is this is the age of independence and autonomy. So your child is going to protest. That is what they're biologically wired to do at this age, and that's totally appropriate. So parents ask me all the time, well, what if my kid throws a fit? They will. They absolutely will. That's totally normal. My kids did it. The difference we see is when you establish those boundaries and that routine and structure at an earlier age, being in toddlerhood, when you kind of see this appetite start to taper, you don't see them protest very long. You don't see the behavioral challenges progress into age 3, age 4, and age 5. The families who didn't necessarily intervene at that impressionable, seemingly innocent window often have these challenges longer and longer because there was just never clear boundaries established in the feeding relationship. So getting back to your question of what can parents do early on, parents can really start to learn how to establish their role in the feeding relationship and how to empower their kids in their role. And so that's when the role shifts from the child being in charge of when the meals are offered to the parents starting to realize, when do these meals and snacks make sense in the course of our day, and, adjusting that as needed to the child's needs. And as mentioned, sometimes kids will have medical issues that may necessitate a little more flexibility or, different gaps and things like that. But for the general public and most typically developing kids, most can go 2 to 3 hours without eating and don't need to be fed on demand. And so that's really something I encourage parents to do, is establish that structure and routine early on as table foods are introduced, so that it just becomes a part of your new normal as they, wean off of a bottle or the breast. And so that then they're just eating with the rest of the family throughout the course of the day, but it's not on their demand and command.
I agree with you 100%. And hey, Ashley, just turn your speaker down a smidge because I think we're getting an echo, just a little tiny bit. Thanks.
Oh, okay.
I agree with you 110%. And I know you have a lot of resources on your website, and I'm going to specifically be asking you about those in just a few minutes, but I wanted to just share with everybody. On my free toolbox tab, I have the ideal feeding schedule for toddlers. And Ashley and I are 100% on the same page about this, that there are eating times and there are growing times. And then there's an eating time again, and then there's a growing time. And somebody like Ashley, especially as an RD, can really help parents figure out the portion size that a child might need, because it does vary a little bit depending on the kiddo, because we want the kids to come to meal times hungry, not hangry, but just a little hunger. Because hunger, I always say, it's the secret sauce. It helps even my most extreme picky eaters. Not to say that hunger is the solution to everything, but it's certainly part of the puzzle. So what about this old adage that, just let them eat what and when they want and they'll be fine? Because I hear that one a lot. Do you hear that too?
Yes, I hear it all the time. And I've written articles on this too before, because often health professionals will give this advice. A lot of parents are going to their pediatrician, which is great, with their feeding concerns. And I know you talk about this heavily, in terms of emphasizing stress. If there's stress, you need to tell your pediatrician you're stressed. And I love that. But I think, parents may tell their pediatrician or another allied health professional, I'm struggling and things like that. But what we see is a lot of times the feedback is just feed them what they'll eat. And what comes with that is feed them when they'll eat. And so to your point of appetite being a good thing, I always help remind parents, hunger is not starvation. We're not talking about neglect. We're not talking about true food insecurity. We're not talking about starving your child. We're talking about setting boundaries on when the kitchen is closed. And I know you have a great sign on that too, for, helping parents and children understand there's times that the kitchen is closed, and that's to help children focus their attention on those growing periods and the parts of the day that are super developmentally appropriate and important for their growth and development, but that don't revolve around food. Because when the child's in charge of what and where, and they get to make those decisions, and we just feed them what and whenever they want, the child's constantly kind of wondering, do I need a little something else? And it's just to take the edge off. They're never truly being nourished, because for most of us, I could eat a lot of delicious snack foods all day and just coast along because I don't have to be truly hungry to eat them. And so a lot of times when parents say, my kid will only eat fruit snacks, goldfish, and milk or something like that, often it's because you don't really, truly have to feel hungry to eat those. I mean, most of us could probably just eat them, mindlessly. but it also is not going to really nourish. And so it's going to take the edge off, but it's not going to give the child a true opportunity for appetite regulation that's going to drive the amount of appetite we need for a child to seek more nourishing foods that actually fill them and fuel them. And so that's where I try and help parents kind of understand like the appetite regulation cycle and what's appropriate at different ages. So they know you are not starving your child. You're just helping them understand how to have that appetite regulation, something that they have intrinsically in infancy, but often in those toddler years gets really confused between these uncertain roles of what the parent's deciding and what the child is deciding. And so I think in terms of when parents get that advice, just feed them what they'll eat and when they eat, they quickly kind of spiral into what I believe you call is like the anxious cycle or anxiety cycle, I think you call it. And so, that it kind of starts to perpetuate some of that is the parent, whatever reason they told the pediatrician, my child's not eating, the pediatrician might have just said, feed them what they'll eat and when they eat. It might have been because there was a concern about weight, or there was a concern about pickiness, or, there can be different impetus as to why maybe the pediatrician or whoever it was gave that advice. But as parents, I always encourage them to really tap the brakes if you hear that advice, or if you just, it could be from family and friends too. This is just what we did. It's not necessarily, I definitely don't mean to vilify a pediatrician at all, but I think, we hear this information from different sources. And I think that's an important chance for parents to realize I'm not actually going to get to my intended goal using that advice, wherever that advice comes from. Instead, helping my child understand structure and routine and boundaries in the feeding relationship, empowering them in their role and also owning my own role can get them where they want to go with fueling their kid. And also, just enjoying meal times together and not having it be this preoccupation with food all day.